Welcome to Blogging Heads. I'm one of your two hosts, Ezra Klein, and I'm here with James Joyner. Hey, James.
Hey, Ezra. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well, doing well.
We are going to begin today by talking about the big news this week, which is that Jesus himself descended from Earth in the guise of General Petraeus, so we're no longer going to have a trinity, but what would that be, a quadruple entity?
I don't know. Yeah.
Descended from heaven to come and give us an update on how Iraq is going. And the Senate assembled, of course, to speak to him. And James, what did you think of the testimony? How did it go?
I think it went pretty well in terms of the goals that were set forth. There had been a pretty long PR or battle going on, leading up to it. I was a little disappointed in it, not from a substantive standpoint, because, if you keep up with this stuff, I guess, it's too much to expect that there's going to be any great revelations. But it was a little underwhelming. It's, sort of, the summer blockbusters, that you hear about for 6 months, and when the movie finally comes out, or you wait and you saw it on DVD, and then it's certainly not that good anymore. I think there was that certain aspect to it where it was just underwhelming from the wonk standpoint. But
sure.
the polling I've seen indicates that it did well, and even a lot of sort of the center left folks, or just people who are maybe not sort of in the move on segment, but definitely are leaning withdrawal, think that he's bought the president some time.
Well, I think there's an interesting question there, right? I mean, there are a couple things to disaggregate. One is whether or not he bought time.
Right.
And the thing is, I don't think he needed to buy time. I think there's a very, very weird belief that the Senate Democrats can do anything. I think for a long time it's been clear they can do nothing, and George W. Bush doesn't care how unpopular he becomes. So whether or not he bought time is, I think, a bit of a misnomer so far as what his testimony was meant to do. The question for me is whether or not David Petraeus is like the two elections we had in Iraq, like the Constitutional Convention we had in Iraq, like the various moments that seemed very, very media-friendly and media-ready that were supposed to denote a turning point. And the problem for Petraeus and the problem for Bush, although I'll explain in a moment I think why it doesn't matter for Bush, but the problem is that Petraeus' testimony was a 2-day story, or maybe a week-long story.
Right.
But then there will be a bombing, then there will be another bombing, and then 95 soldiers will die in another bombing. And, what has destroyed the Iraq venture is not an insufficient number of eloquent spokespeople, but the steady sort of drip, drop of bad news out of a region simply not doing well.
Oh, no, I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right. But if you believe in the mission, and I gather the president does, and General Petraeus does, and a few of us still do. Although I think that our numbers are dwindling. Mm-hmm. You have to point to signs of hope. You have to point to the milestones, and the nature of counterinsurgency has always been that it's brutal. It takes a ridiculously long time to do it. The advantage is clearly with the insurgents. It's just they can win by not losing, kind of thing. And the combination of the nature of counterinsurgency and just the nature of sort of regular warfare, even for a country that's used to sort of a push-button mentality for war. I was in, a long time ago now during Desert Storm, and I think everybody thinks that war, at least Americans think that war should be Desert Storm. That you have a bunch of sorties.
And to be clear, this was sold as Desert Storm too.
Oh, absolutely.
We'll be out of there in 2 or 3 months. It'll cost us $16 and a sandwich. The Iraqi people will then give us half of the sandwich back because they're not that high. This was supposed to be a cakewalk.
Yeah, I think that is a little oversold. And I think the president at least hedged his bets on that. But there were certainly some of his supporters, used that sort of terminology. Mm-hmm. But none of us, I think none of us, or at least few of us that were ultimately persuaded that going in was the right thing to do, thought we would still be, in this kind of mess 2 years down the road, let alone 5 years down the road. There's no question about that.
And I think something else should be said on Petraeus, because I basically hate what was done with him. I think it was a very calculated move on the administration's part to disassociate the war with Bush and put it on a new figure, a new great man of history. And the reason I hate it is because it's dishonest. I think you can see it on the left and the right, right?
Sure.
A couple months ago on the left, everybody was saying, listen to these generals who are speaking out against the war in Iraq.
Right.
Shouldn't we listen to them? They know what they're talking about. And the people on the right said, no.
Yes.
Those guys don't know what they're talking about. They're just disgruntled generals. There is civilian control of the American military, and it is a really important. It is a very important ideal to uphold. And then Petraeus comes out and he's saying the opposite thing as some of those generals were, and now we're saying, no, don't listen to that general. We have civilian control of the military. The right is saying in many ways the opposite. A couple months down the road, according to Newsweek, we're going to have a report from the Pentagon led by Admiral Fallon saying we should have a much more rapid drawdown to 1/3 of what we have in there now because that's what we need for a strategy. And then the left will say, listen to Fallon. It doesn't matter, and I think the place you got that the most, it's time to take this off of the generals. Both sides are using the military men for credibility when it suits their purposes, but you saw it really well with Petraeus, I think, when he came, and there was this great moment in the testimony, and I'm sure you saw it or saw it after. John Warner, the senator from Virginia who's retiring to likely be replaced by another Warner, which would be save on nameplate construction. So Warner says to Petraeus, will this make America safer? Will your strategy make America safer? And Petraeus says, I think absolutely this is the best strategy for Iraq. And Warner sort of shakes his head and says, no, but will it make America safer? And Petraeus says, I'm sorry, sir, I haven't thought about that yet.
Right.
And that's, insofar as it goes, Petraeus has a mission. He's attempting to carry it out.
Sure.
He could have been being politic. He could have not seen it as his role to speak on that. Whatever it may or may not have been. But it is utterly absurd to think that what the Senate should do is take the plan of a man who has not considered whether or not this is within the greater strategic interest of America.
Right.
That isn't how these wars should be fought. It isn't how they should be, how policy for them should be decided. And it sort of goes to show the narrowness of relying on these sort of flavor of the month generals for your analysis. It's got to be a much broader viewpoint, and that's one thing that we've really lost in Iraq. I think it's true in the Democratic primary, where Iraq has begun to overshadow other differences and distinctions in ideology and foreign affairs. But more generally, we're not having any sort of significant conversation over America's role in the world or its interests. We are just talking about Iraq.
No, I
and that
think
isn't
that's
the right
right.
way to be doing this.
And it's really, it's the reason that you talked about earlier. It is the steady drip. It's the story that won't go away, and it's hard to get beyond that. Some people, I think people, John McCain and others are trying to put it in the larger concept. The only rationale I think at this point for staying in Iraq, other than the sort of moral we owe it to them, we started this, we've got to clean it up, we owe it to them mentality, is the impact on the region and broader sort of regional geostrategic interest for the country. But certainly, it is not the role of generals to decide what's in the country's interest in the macro sense. That is above their pay grade. Even though at the 4-star level, at the sync level, or operational commander level, politics and strategy sort of go hand in hand to some point. Certainly when you fight in counterinsurgency, politics is very much a part of what's going on. Mm-hmm. But it's very much and I've been on the civilian control side of this thing pretty consistently. I think that.
Sure.
You need people. Petraeus is a very impressive man, and if anybody can fix this thing, I guess he's got a resume that's made to measure for this. He's been incredibly successful as a military man and as a scholar, as a thinker about this kind of thing. And he's been thinking about this sort of stuff forever. But
I've begun to find him real annoying on that level.
Right.
I'm sorry, I want to let you finish your point, but just remind me, because this General David Petraeus' impressive thing.
Right.
He's sort of uniquely impressive to media elite.
Right.
He's got a PhD, went to Princeton. He's like them, or like us, I guess would be the better way to put that. And I was really reminded of this so Spencer Ackerman went out, who's also Blogging Head's participant.
Right.
And a lot of media people have had this experience. They go out to interview him in Iraq. And he makes him interview him while doing his morning exercise routine.
Right.
So he creates, he's very, very smart. So they're on this 5-mile run. It's like these soft, sort of sedentary media types,
Right.
huffing and puffing. To them, Petraeus looks, he's like jogging his 5 miles, completely non-winded, giving perfectly articulate and coherent answers.
Right.
He's done such a remarkable job leveraging his personal qualities. He's one of the most brilliant media figures I think we've seen in a very, very long time. I don't think anybody in the Democratic or Republican primaries can touch Petraeus' sense of timing or his understanding of what the press wants for its story. But I again believe that we've begun to see and that's been unhelpful, that we're getting lost in sort of, I think the essential Bush strategy here was, can you make the Iraq War a referendum on General David Petraeus?
Right.
If you can, you can keep it going indefinitely. If you can't, at the very least, you're going to lose ever more public support.
No, I think that's right.
Petraeus is good at doing that.
But, and I think the two sides, as you mentioned earlier, to, sort of pick and choose, at what point they want to rely on the military, and obviously it has to do with, whether the military is, buttressing their position or not. I think that Democrats have for a while been sort of doing it from the standpoint of there is a historic and largely I think undeserved sort of sense that the Democrats don't have the military experience and are sort of out of touch with the military and that sort of thing, which is largely silly. Although you get some moments here and there where you get that buttressed. And on the Republican side, I think at this point it's just simply a function of we've lost the public opinion debate. I think on the war, or at least we're certainly losing it. And I think for good reason. It's again that the situation where the thing was oversold and in terms of of the gains and sort of undersold in terms of the risks and the commitment that was involved. And so it's natural that it has happened, but President Bush has lost the ability, certainly, and perhaps long lost the ability to say, "Trust me on this," and say, "Hey, but David Petraeus, even the Democrats like him. Everybody admits, he's a super guy." But I wrote a post, I don't know, several weeks ago, talking about Petraeus fetishism. As impressive as the guy is, the idea, for example, that he wrote the counterinsurgency manual, as a 4-star generals write manuals, sort of thing, is sort of annoying, but it's understandable. I think the press and Democrats, sort of as institutions, are very loath to be seen as being against sort of military, being labeled as anti-military for a variety of historical reasons. And that is, I think, been exacerbated by the fact that so few members of Congress have military experience, and I think there's a fetishism generally of the military. It's and I say that as someone who's been in the military and comes from a military family, but the idea that we have to listen to the generals and that everything they say is gold and gospel and they're sort of unerring folks, and that and we have to do what they say is odd and goes against our traditions going back even to the time of Washington, who was a general but was very clear on where the delineation was.
Sure. I think then that's actually a good segue into Bush's speech from last night. So to go to the civilian control here, my editor Harold Myerson had a very funny remark on this. He said it's as if Bush didn't, or to paraphrase him, it's as if Bush didn't understand his own political strategy. He just got enough having David Petraeus sell the war as a function of David Petraeus, and then he reassociated himself with it. But I'll tell you what, I again think he'll be overtaken by the drip drop of events over there, but I thought this was the best speech I saw Bush give in a very long time. I thought it was a pack of lies, but I thought it was by far the best he's looked in front of a camera since re-election, basically. It's been, to my eyes, a series of terrible public appearances on Bush's part. Terrible public appearances. And for the first time, he seemed to feel a bit of wind at his back, and he went in and if I had come down from Mars or Canada or something I didn't know about the Iraq War and I watched that speech, I'd say, all right, That seems pretty reasonable.
Right.
But I want to talk to you about this sort of strategic pact
Okay.
that he's beginning to go into, and this idea that we are going to be there defending Baghdad for a long time. I mean, we have strategic pacts with, he apparently used the example of Korea when he was briefing reporters on it. And
Right.
in Korea, we have, it's a very distinct, and to some degree maybe not even be a good idea anymore, but a very distinct thing we are defending. We are on a line,
Yes.
looking north and saying, okay, nobody comes through here.
Right.
In Iraq, we're defending Iraq from Iraq.
Well, yes.
And the question of who we are defending, what is the state we're talking about, what does Maliki represent, who does he represent, which Shiite militias are being advantaged by that government.
Right.
I feel like I don't know what these guys are doing anymore. At some point, my sense of analysis fails, and I look at it and, we're so excited that we've begun to be able to arm Sunni tribes.
Right.
Who are themselves kicking out insurgents who are there because of us.
Right.
The jihadists are there to stop America. Okay, we leave, they'll probably be all killed by the Sunnis, or the worst case scenario for Iraq, but the best, by the way, for American geopolitical interests is that they become a Sunni sort of political group and an anti-Shiite group, turning the Arab world against al-Qaeda and its attendant allies. But this idea that we're going to be there forever in a strategic pact, I don't understand what Bush anymore is trying to accomplish, except to in some way go down in history as a guy who didn't lose this war. He fought the brave fight. I'm done. Maybe you get it more than I do, James. I hope you do.
I don't know. Clearly, you have a situation where we're having a very difficult time thinking strategically, other than in a sense of, losing. I think there's some sense that, losing this thing has some major strategic fallout both in Iraq and in the region that we've got to avoid. But I think in terms of what we're fighting for, I think that's very much a shifting thing. I think we originally had these pie in the sky, sort of worst of Woodrow Wilson, Jimmy Carter, and everything else sort of put together. This bold vision that we're going to go in there by the use of force and create this exemplar democracy that was then going to have sort of a reverse domino theory and take over the Middle East and this rising tide of democracy was bizarre. But that was clearly what at least was sold as what his vision was. And now it is. I think it's a reaction against whatever is going bad. We're trying to fix that. It's very much sort of monovision. Even the surge. The odd thing is that in many ways we've almost turned the surge on its head, even though it's a fairly new phenomenon. We went from we're going to go in here, we're going to basically create this firewall around some major population centers to give time for political reconciliation. Political reconciliation not only isn't happening, they basically took a month off from even trying, which was really unfortunate timing. And mysteriously, and I think most people, even Petraeus himself, I think to his credit, has basically deflected the idea that we're sort of having internal fighting now where the Sunnis are taking on al-Qaeda. Largely, that is not a function of the surge. It's something that happened. It just happened to be happening when the surge started. Or even more sort of oddly, the idea that local sheikhs and tribal leaders, whatever sort of nomenclature that we assign to that, are asserting power, and so we're going to, instead of doing a top-down sort of model where democracy establishes itself and unity and stability establishes itself on a political order and then it works down, we're going to have it happen magically sort of in reverse. And that is, I suppose if it works and there's some magical Iraq unity that comes out of that would be, would be wonderful. But it's certainly not even at the tactical level, let alone at a strategic level, what we thought was going to happen 6 months ago.
Right.
But it's a riding. You're basically trying to ride the successes, such as you can take them, and try to.
And whatever successes, anything that can look like one at this point is getting the ride.
Oh, sure, sure.
Tribes getting armed. Whatever it is, this is now becoming evidence that something is working. And and I'd like to hear your thought on this. I don't know. I mean, I think the best case scenario for Iraq is we get the hell out, and I don't even know what happens.
Right.
I mean, obviously in a responsible way, but I don't know what an optimist would now believe the best case scenario is. I don't know what an optimist on how this war is going thinks. I don't know what they think can be accomplished. And I mean, you at least alluded earlier to the fact that you're still somewhat of a supporter of it. What do you think best case can happen in Iraq?
Best case I think is probably, a confederation, or very weak federalism, which is basically what I wanted, back in summer of '03. So at least you're probably asking, what an optimist view is. Maybe, I'm probably not the best person to ask. Optimism tends not to be my strong suit. But, I thought, heck, the United States, which, had a lot more going for it in, in its sort of post-colonial period, than Iraq did, didn't try to do a unitary state. It understood that there were regional variations and local preferences that had to be dealt with. They were much less pronounced and deep-seated than the sectarian things, which are sort of, obviously, made really manifest by decades of oppression under the Baathists. But if we could have some sort of local autonomy, as much as the Kurds have enjoyed for quite some time now, and extend that, create a security consensus, and certainly I think the United States is beyond being able to make that happen, let alone the United States military. I think we've acknowledged for 2 years that there's not going to be a military solution. That the military can help provide security, which can provide breathing room on politics.
So people say it's never been clear to me what sense that formulation made.
Right.
I mean, even assume a good situation in which the military does create security, providing breathing room on politics. Theoretically, we got some of that. Politics didn't get any better, but I've never really understood what people think is the causal mechanism there. Like, why wouldn't politics move forward faster in a situation of higher tension? I mean, to give it a bit of an analogy here, I'm not saying we want to burn Iraq down for political reconciliation, but it just isn't clear to me that, I wouldn't think you have a better chance of getting health care in this country passed when everybody's really happy with their health care, or even somewhat happy with health care. The other side of that is that, somebody, an Iraq expert, said this the other day, and I'm forgetting who. I think Brian Catullus, a cap. But he said, reconciliation doesn't necessarily come through the political process. What it may come through is simply the facts on the ground. And part of what's going on in the surge, part of why you're seeing things better, is that there's been an enormous amount of ethnic cleansing and displacement already. And that violence is, in its way, creating the political solution. It's creating the situation. I mean, Baghdad has gone from a heavily majority Sunni city to a heavily majority Shiite city. That's a huge deal. A huge deal. And I just don't know how the security, I don't know, I just don't really understand what people mean when they say the security will give the breathing room for political reconciliation. I mean, they either want the reconciliation or not.
The problem is, violence, has multiple effects. The psychology of war is really strange. During World War II, the Blitz, the idea that, basically that, all that destruction, rallied the English and made them, more determined than ever. Yet at the same time, we ended the war by, dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and breaking, the enemy's will. So it works oddly, and I guess maybe not in predictable ways. I think the idea is that that the constant tension creates this basic tribal feud and the need for escalation, and that if you could break that cycle for some period of time, that you could sit down and have a more rational dialogue. But it is true that things often, the Edward Luttwak, give war a chance thesis, from years ago, that wars solve things by taking away people's choices and making things harder. My boss's boss now, General Jones, who a couple of weeks ago put out, headed the Blue Ribbon Commission that basically said that the security structure in Iraq, at least on the police side, is a mess and we need to sort of reboot the thing, suggested basically followed the model that the Dayton Accords model in Bosnia, and there was not much elaboration, and he gave a talk on it a couple of nights ago at the Atlantic Council and sort of declined to really elaborate further. Because the problem with the Dayton model is that it certainly would be failure under any definition of success we had even as much as a year ago. Partition, frankly, that was made possible by some very successful ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is a very, it solves some problems. It ultimately ended the Indian Wars in the United States. It solves, it has solved things in a lot of places. It's, obviously not, a means to an end that we'd like to see, given that. If we did, it may be too much to say that this is entirely our fault, but certainly we've set the stage for allowing this to happen. Maybe it's we're just sort of falling prey to the logical fallacy of sort of consequentialism. That the alternatives would be so bad that it has to work.
Well, this sort of there's a quote in Lyndon Johnson's memoirs, where he says, I really believed we couldn't pull out of Vietnam. I believed we had to win. I thought that if we let Vietnam fall, all of Southeast Asia would go next, that the communists would take Southeast Asia from Jakarta to Bangkok, and we'd be fighting them in Berlin. And there is a tendency to the failure becomes so politically inconceivable that you begin to take these real strange worst-case scenarios. And I'll say two things. One is Bob Dreyfus in the Washington Monthly wrote a very, very good article a number of months ago that I'll get put into the side. I wish I could remember the name of it. I think it's Apocalypse Not is the name of it. Apocalypse Not, on why withdrawing wouldn't create some sort of hellish scenario. And I'm actually working on something that I believe quite strongly that withdrawal would actually make things better. Withdrawal gives a certain amount of political leverage. It is still the case, according to the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, that the majority of attacks in Iraq are at us, are at America. And those attacks don't just hit us, of course, they hit Iraqi civilians, they destroy infrastructure, they take out the sense of normalcy. Petraeus' neighborhood councils, or whatever he's calling them, where there's like little neighborhood army outposts that have helped the army get closer to the people, have become a magnet for insurgent attacks. So I think there are very good reasons to think that not only will the worst not happen, but that we have provided in many ways an irritant. We have not decelerated the Civil War, but in fact have in many ways accelerated, been more of a magnet for jihadists, and on and on. It's an interesting fact that what they're arguing with the surge is not that it worked, not that American troops made it all better, but that in some really fuzzy way, because it had nothing to do with the surge, which is why they can't pinpoint a causal mechanism, the Sunni tribes turned on the insurgency. But that suggests that what will save Iraq, if that's all that can be effective, is the Iraqi people, not America. And it doesn't look to me that what we're doing there is either holding hell at bay or good for us. Or good for the Iraqis, for that matter. So I don't know. I'm very pessimistic. I'm so beaten down by the whole thing at this point that I've been in a weird situation for probably 5-6 months or more now, where I'm both pessimistic and sort of think that pulling out will make things even worse, but have little sense that things are going to get better anytime soon by staying there. And there is, I think, some basis for hope that that the Iraqis would have little choice but to stand up and engage. And it may well be that Al Qaeda goes away in Iraq. Now, to the extent that they're an external threat, I think I don't think they're going to go back and start farms somewhere. So maybe they take their success and try to export it elsewhere. Right. Well, but it's a scary thing. But the problem is that Al Qaeda was begun in Afghanistan fighting the Soviets. We are training the next generation of jihadists. There's Mark Lynch at CAP had a really good article yesterday about how the Sunnis are constructing the narrative of Iraq too. And it's not what we hear now that our great troops came in, emboldening them to go against the insurgents. It's that America failed, came to them, begged, and finally they, because of their awesome Sunnis, came in and were able to shut some of this. This idea that what we do there
Sure.
by leaving is help them in political propaganda. I'll say three things on that. One is that the propaganda war is lost. We have showed ourselves to be vulnerable and defeatable. Number two is that as long as we are there, any propaganda,
Right.
it's not mere propaganda, but we accelerate recruitment. The propaganda has a sort of forward-looking phase. Listen, America is defeatable and vulnerable. Come kill it.
Right.
And three, as long as we're there, we are training the people. We are turning angry young men into skilled bomb makers by letting them practice on America. It's the most bizarre strategy in the world, and it's not making us safer. You know,
Right.
The Center for American Progress and Foreign Policy, the magazine, did this survey of 100 foreign policy experts, people worked administrations, Republican and Democrat, and what was it, 91 or 80 or 81? 91 or 81 said the Iraq War was making us less safe as a country.
I think it's 91, and you know,
91.
I'm not enough of an expert to make the cut, I guess. But I mean, I would certainly have joined that.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly, whether prospectively it could have made us safer, if you'd asked me at a much earlier point in time, I guess I would have said it would have. But
Mm-hmm.
it rather demonstrably hasn't right now. I mean, the question is where from here, and partly that has to do with whether there's any hope at all for turning this thing around and salvaging something. And but what that something is unclear. It's a more stable Iraq that is less violent. I guess is about all you're going to get in the short term. And obviously, that's worse than a status quo ante. So.
Yeah, well, I wish the first thing that popped to mind was the soft bigotry of low expectations, and then I realized at this point that ain't a low expectation for Iraq.
No, it's not. It's. I mean, that would be. We would take that and be pleased right now. Given we're given the status quo, but it's certainly a worse scenario than what we had. At least in terms of the ongoing security situation. Now, what we gain by Saddam Hussein and the Hussein boys being out of power and all that sort of thing is, I guess, unknowable. But he was a regional threat and all of that. But in terms of the current security picture, I mean, things are certainly worse. And the irony is, of course, is that when we left in '91 and all of the hand wringing about why we didn't finish the job, the argument was, well, the Iranian counterbalancing and what it would do to our alliance both in Europe and in the Middle East. And of course, we've seen that those laments were true because, in fact, we've had all those things sort of come to fruition now. So.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's correct.
Yeah.
I think we should move on to Thompson, speaking of the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Okay.
Although for him, I think it's been the opposite, right?
Yes, very much.
He is, I think, he's internet dating. He's like an internet dating horror story. Everybody looked at him online. He had these great pictures, looked really hot. And he had this great profile. He seemed to believe all the right things. He loved good bands, loved good music. And then everybody went on a date with him. The conservatives went on a date with him. Turned out he was way older. Number one. Still going. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I seem to be back on. If people see me freezing around there, I apologize. And in fact, I was moving and talking during that entire experience. Right. But, he seemed to me to be a tremendous early flop. What do you think?
Well, I mean, he was not a guy that I was interested in or am still interested in. In terms of the polls I'm seeing, at least the national polls, which are, granted, incredibly meaningless, he's running neck and neck with Giuliani in most of the aggregated polls. He's not doing, particularly well in the early primary stakes, but, he seems to be doing well. They certainly got some online support. The why is what interests me because I'm not sure. Thompson was elected to the Senate about the time I moved to Tennessee. Taught for a year at Tennessee Chattanooga, so we overlapped a little bit there. Mm-hmm. And right away, he comes in as a freshman, and there was talk of him for president, for him for the vice presidential ticket.
Really.
And this was national talk. It wasn't just people in Tennessee talking about him. And, I gathered that, it was just, he had this presence, this charisma, which I don't quite see. I mean, I guess he's got that sort of that deep voice, and he's tall.
He's very tall.
Which I guess are, apparently very important things, for a leader to have.
But that really appears to be it, right? He's very tall. People make fun of Chris Matthews because he said, when you look at Thompson, can you smell the aqua velva, the old leather?
Right.
But Ross Douthat, who I think has a real smart opinion on, said, that's the only intelligent thing anybody ever said about Thompson. That's literally his campaign. Like, can you look at him? Do you smell the old leather? Do you see Arthur Branch?
Right. No, and it's and there's clearly an appeal to that. The Republicans
Don't Republicans find it insulting to all this guy does not care enough about the movement to even familiarize himself with basic issues of public policy and Republican dogma, like McCain-Feingold. He's like, well, I don't know about this bill that I passed and helped sponsor and helped turn out something similar on a commission. Like, don't people feel insulted by that?
Maybe not. The problem is the Republicans. The Democrats are as well, but there's a different sort of coalition. The Republican coalition became a majority coalition, or at least a coalition that had a chance to divide on a regular basis for the majority. In the 80s, with their merger with the Christian right, who had largely been dormant until they were successfully mobilized by Jerry Falwell and a bunch of others. Ronald Reagan captured that very well, and there has always been a very deep cultural sort of thing, I think, with a large part of the conservative movement, which is that we care more that that you believe the right things and that you've got, we trust you and that sort of thing, more so, I think, than the pure agenda-driven thing. I think people are less concerned about people touting the right ideology than saying the right things about their relationship with God and the family values and all that kind of thing. I think that just matters more to a lot of people than stances on the issues. And maybe that's conflated or goes into issues of character and judgment and some other things. But I think people are concerned about or interested in having sort of the right kind of man, and figure that they'll make the right decisions, rather than somebody who is, very knowledgeable and you can write policy papers, but they don't really quite trust them.
But it's just weird because
Republicans never much care for George, Bush Sr.
It's strange because I'm very much one type who's like, let me see your policy paper, John Edwards. And I push for ever more detailed, and a lot of people say it's the wrong sort of thing to be asking of a presidential candidate. But I don't do it because I think that what their policy paper has will reflect what they do in the end. I do it because I want them to lay down markers that they can be hit with later if they don't come through. And B, because I don't know what they believe. I don't know what John Edwards, what Hillary Clinton, what Barack Obama thinks in the moments before they go to bed at night. And I guess I don't understand what the analytical technique being used to divine Fred Thompson's secret opinions is, particularly when he doesn't seem to be if John Edwards appears to think he's got to at least pretend to be a staunch advocate of a particular type of universal health care, I think he, number one, knows the arguments that I find convincing, so hopefully he, too, is convinced. And number two, he feels political pressure for that. Thompson, I guess from where I sit, it looks like he's lying a lot. I agree with you. Romney, I guess, is the same way, but people saw that about Romney, but I think Thompson smells like aqua velva or something. Nobody,
No, I think there's something to that. The problem is I don't know if it's a problem, but I guess our analytical problem here is that, I think both of us sort of view this thing in analytical terms, and we're people who are, mostly policy driven. And that makes two of us, and I guess there are we make up an incredibly small, insignificant part of the electorate, and by the way, we're the part of the electorate that doesn't need to be convinced, because it's conceivable that I could vote for a Democrat for president, but it's probably not conceivable that the Democrats will nominate a Democrat I could vote for, and probably the same with you with the Republicans. So I think that we don't even need to be convinced. It's the people who are for marginal voters who are but who want a guy they can have a beer with, or that they trust their daughter with, kind of thing.
Right.
Those are the people that have to be persuaded and encouraged to vote. It's not us.
And I think, by the way, maybe if one were to say it's a cynical move, they think Fred Thompson will persuade these people. Maybe that's what it is. I could possibly agree with them, although I actually think he's sort of weak. But
right.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same people. I mean, it's the people who are sort of like you and me, like these guys at Red State who went on a conference call and were like, "Oh my God, you can just hear how tall that man is. Yeah, how tall and conservative." And
there is that.
It's strange to watch. I mean, I guess Democrats, look, God knows we've had some weird primaries on my side as well, and but. Yeah.
I don't know. I think the Republicans. The Red Staters are for the most part kids.
Hey man, nothing wrong with being a kid.
Well, no, that's true. I was one many years ago myself, I guess, but I don't know. There is this yearning for another Ronald Reagan. That Republicans can't get over. I think that in a sense that I think that Democrats have finally gotten over wanting another JFK. Maybe because Clinton was in many ways sort of that again, and although in maybe a little bit too real a sense, given a different media environment. But and Thompson sort of has some of that in addition, including the actor background. And part of it is I think the Republicans have been, and of course we tried to do that with Bush. I think the idea that what you need is somebody who is sort of a values guy and who can sort of is sunny and optimistic. Neither of which, in some ways, Bush really turned out to be. I think once he started getting beat down, he's much more Nixonian in a character way. I don't mean that even in a sort of a negative sense that he's a bad guy, because I actually don't think that he is. Although I'm not sure I really thought that of Nixon in many ways. But although I'm not quite old enough that I was I look at Nixon sort of as a historical figure rather than But I think he's got this sort of this paranoia that Nixon had, and some of those sort of things. But I think that there is this yearning for this optimistic, sort of communicator guy, and that the issues almost don't matter. Other than in this broad sense. Okay, you love Jesus, and you love the family, and you love America. And beyond that, we sort of fill in the details, and it's annoying to those of us who are a little bit more sort of public policy oriented. It's understandable from a strategic standpoint that there is there's this recruitment effort. Clearly, I think Thompson probably would like to be president. I think he's having some time. It took a long time to decide he actually wanted to run to be president because it's hard and it's a brutal process. But there was a recruitment that it wasn't just Red State types. It was Howard Baker and some others.
That's totally true. And I think part of it was people thought Giuliani would be weaker than he actually looks now. What about the others? What about the second tier? Why does nobody care about them?
It is an interesting point. I mentioned earlier, the Democrats that, for example, that I think are interesting, they can't get any airtime. Guys like, Bill Richardson, for example. But and I think you've written some positive things about Mike Huckabee, who frankly I barely know much about, other than he was governor of Arkansas and he used to be fat, now he's not, and how inspirational that apparently is. But those guys who have real executive experience and some record of accomplishment just can't get off the radar screen. I don't know if it's a lack of charisma. If it's simply, that we've set the agenda so early, with the expectations game. And, I've done, I wrote a post, 5 months ago or something, people who will not get elected president. And, listed virtually everybody who was running, or who was flirting with running, including guys like Huckabee, It's just that, they weren't sufficiently on the national radar screen ahead of time. Right. And, Jimmy Carter managed to do it in '76 in a very weird election cycle, coming out of Watergate. But I don't know that anybody else has done it in your lifetime.
Although I think Huckabee is, by the way, actually getting a bit more press. In some ways, I think the more interesting version of this is on my end.
Yeah.
I think Bill Richardson doesn't know just about anything about public policy. I interviewed him recently and did a piece on his economics, and I mean, that may be going too far. He's very opportunistic in the way he talks about it, so I'm not crying too many tears over him. And he hasn't really. He's got this record of accomplishment, but accomplishments that aren't very impressive. I mean, he's done some real interesting diplomatic work. Don't get me wrong on that, but. So maybe he should be Secretary of State. He didn't bring universal health care to New Mexico, or you watch that commercial he did. It's like, I brought teacher pay up from 112th to 22nd, which is like, I guess, a large raise, but so what about the other 22 governors who are doing better?
Right.
But Biden and Dodd are fascinating figures, I think, and Dodd particularly because if you are a liberal. I mean, a very, very good case can be made that Dodd would be the finest president of the bunch. He's more liberal, who really gets ascended. The guy can give a great speech. He's got a real sort of moral force to him. He's very impassioned. But he cannot get a point in the polls. It is unbelievable. No. And Biden, you say what you will about him, and I have my disagreements with the guy on foreign policy, and he talks too long, and how dare that be the case in a politician. But, it's rare that primary voters are super sophisticated about picking apart internal incoherencies in foreign policy arguments, and the guy sounds very credible. He's very, very good at sounding credible, at sounding aggressive. I mean, in some ways, he's more Thompson than Thompson is. He's like the sort of guy, what the hell are you talking about? Like, that's crap.
Right. No, that's right. And Dodd, I mean, it probably is your version of Romney in the sense that he at least looks like, what a president ought to look like in a lot of ways, I guess.
Dodd?
Yeah, he's got, he's got a good head of hair, and he's just he's kind of grandfatherly without looking old. It's a kind of a. I guess
that's not a bad point. I don't know.
But no, and Biden, it is again a strange case where I've heard several fairly conservative Republicans express admiration for the guy because I think he's a straight talking kind of guy. Although ironically he was run out of his last presidential race for plagiarism.
He was straight talking somebody else's talk.
Hey, which is and of course that's ironic at a lot of levels. But as if politicians write their own damn speeches, right? But
more to the point, as if the problem with Joe Biden, we're worried about in the future, is that Joe Biden won't think of enough things to say.
Right. Yeah.
It's as if he's been spending his entire career saying, no, I can do this. Like, believe me, I don't need anybody else to write my lines. I'll write more than you can possibly bear.
No, man, he got elected to the Senate before you were constitutionally eligible.
Right. He
was
turned
29.
eligible during the period between election and inauguration. Yeah, no, he got elected to the Senate at 13. It's all very impressive, and he's a fairly impressive guy in Iraq. He sounds very credible, but I think it's real telling on the Democratic side because, frankly, the top of the Republican. The top of the Republican primary, aside from Thompson, is a very sort of impressive bunch. You have an executive who is fairly successful. You had who did, he's not talking about it ever, but who did bring a pretty credible universal health care plan to mass. You have Romney, you have Giuliani, who's a very successful executive of New York, and you have McCain, who's been, pretty prominent senator, one might argue.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry about that. We're back at Blogging Heads, where my cord fell out of my computer, rendering me no longer an effective virtual entity. But we're about done anyway, because like everybody else, you can only talk. Like everybody else, we agree that you can't talk about the second-tier candidates for very long. It's too boring. But thank you for watching, and James, thank you for joining me at it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I enjoyed it.
All right. Well, have fun out there in Blogging Heads land. Bye.